Again, taking up right where we left off, certain people in California are petitioning Congress for admission to the Union as a state without even waiting to be organized as a territory. Skip straight from unorganized territory all the way to states so they would have a government strong enough to impose order, law and order, in a completely out of control, very dangerous situation where just daily life is producing a casualty rate equivalent to that of the Civil War. Now, we'll start from there. There's one more backward glance I want to give at the Wilmot Proviso and why it was so controversial in the South. So if Southerners felt like they're the ones who defeated Mexico, they should be able to take their slaves into the Mexican cession. But then the Wilmot Proviso comes along as if, sports analogy again, here come the Northerners trotting out on the field after the game's over with no grass stains on their uniforms. They snatch the trophy away and say, mine. People could get nettled about that, quite apart from the very dubious morality of this whole thing. And as we know, God had determined where slavery was going to go and where it was not. You ever been to Arizona, New Mexico? Any of that looked like Mississippi to you? Slavery, that does not, that ain't gonna happen. And of course, Southerners probably didn't even realize that. So it's all about nothing as far as that's concerned. Okay, so you have the controversy about whether California would be admitted to the Union. It's seeking admission to the Union as a free state. There are no slave states, potential slave states lined up ready to keep the balance in the Senate. Texas does not yet have enough people, enough population to support dividing it and, making another slave state out of part of Texas. So this is a hot one. You move eastward a bit and you come to Texas, which was 2/3 again as big as it is now. That's not all populated and settled. That's just the southeastern portion. But the original boundaries of the state of Texas for the first 5 years followed the Rio Grande all the way to its source in Colorado, due north from there all the way up into what's now Wyoming. It included over half of what's now New Mexico, the Oklahoma Panhandle, a good bit of Colorado, and a little bit of Wyoming. It's huge. So there was a push to reduce Texas to more reasonable dimensions. And Texas was vulnerable to a buyout because the government of the state was very deeply in debt. Okay, that's an issue. Would Texas really be that big? Now, if there would have been an issue over whether you could make a slave state north of the Missouri Compromise line, but Texas had not been part of the Union at the time of that compromise. Now, there's an issue involving the District of Columbia, south of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Slavery and the slave trade were both legal in Washington, D.C. Okay? In fact, Washington, D.C. was a major hub of the slave trade. There were people whose business was buying and selling slaves to plantation owners or whatnot. And so in the North, now, we'll be getting to abolitionism later. That's the idea that the federal government should abolish slavery nationwide. That was still viewed as a very fringe, radical kind of idea because it would involve an unprecedented use of federal power, among other things. But you didn't have to be an abolitionist crazy to object to the fact that human beings were being bought and sold at public auction within sight of the United States Capitol building. So there's a push to abolish slavery as well as the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Now, Southerners strongly object to that because that would put a patch of free soil between the slave states of Virginia and Maryland and make worse a problem they thought they had. They were overestimating it, but it's going on, and that is slaves running away. Slaves ran away. I mean, I would if I could get a chance. You would too, probably, with some frequency. Most of the time, they're just taking a little vacation. sneak off. They call it laying out, hide out for a while just to get some rest. Maybe even attempt to reconnect at least briefly with a spouse or other loved ones who'd been sold to other plantations. But as time went on, more and more of the fugitives were attempting to be free by moving north into free states. Of course, you can still be caught and returned to the south. Somebody comes and claims you, as we'll see, because there was a fugitive slave law that's been on the books for decades. To really be, game over free, you'd have to make it all the way to Canada, and a glance at the map will show how pretty much not a possibility that is. Okay, it's just you get across the Great Lakes. There's just not really very many ways to get directly into Canada. Anyway, um, so Southern slave owners thought they had a big problem with runaways. Um, it's hard to sympathize with them. I don't personally even try, but a single slave would cost far more than like an average farmer could ever hope to afford. Only about 1 out of 4 households owned any slaves, and the number that had like dozens or hundreds, that's very small. But back to the subject. Um, Southerners wanted an updated, far tougher fugitive slave law. That's another issue. Southerners want the slave law updated. As I said, there was one that had been on the books for decades. I always thought it was around 1811. It may have been the 1790s. I'm not even sure. They just didn't think it covered enough situations. Um, they were indulging in the illusion that what makes laws enforceable is the severity of the penalties and that sort of thing. And that's really not what makes laws enforceable to the extent that they are. What makes them enforceable is the extent to which the public wants to see them enforced. Unpopular laws are almost impossible to enforce. But again, back to the subject. Now, it was a fairly open secret, or belief, maybe I should say. I happen to believe it's true that there were people who were assisting fugitives, assisting runaways on their way to the north. That there was a sort of clandestine network known as the Underground Railroad. We're not talking about a subway train here. Underground, like a underground newspaper. It's hidden. It's clandestine. Um, and these would be, farmers who disapproved of slavery, who would conceal fugitives, give them food, whatever they needed, give them directions to the next station on the Underground Railroad. Okay, I believe that there was an Underground Railroad. The problem historians have is actually documenting it, because participating in this is a federal crime. Very few people would ever be prosecuted for it, but you got to be concerned about that. Now, I got to ask you a question here. Whenever you commit a federal crime, are you careful to leave a paper trail? You understand what I'm saying here? So there's very little documentation other than accusations in the press of such a thing. But I believe it was there. There was one particular escaped slave, a woman named Sojourner Truth, who became an expert guide and went back into the South many times, bringing out other African Americans to freedom from slavery. Anyway, Southerners want this thing. Now, historians have looked into this, and the slave owners are losing, on average, looks like about 1,000 slaves a year. That's out of a population of more than 4 million. So, numbers are kind of cold and sterile, but there you go. Okay, so all of this stuff came to a head in the year 1850. That if these problems don't get solved, the Union's in deep trouble. That some states are, think threatening to bail and dissociate themselves from the United States unless this can be resolved in a manner satisfactory, minimally satisfactory to everybody. All right, who's the go-to guy to fix stuff like this? Henry Clay of Kentucky, who'd time and again over his long career, by 1850 he's aged and feeble, but time and again he'd ridden to the rescue, coming up with compromises that would band-aid the Union for another few years. So this is his last attempt. Along about February or so of 1850, don't hold me to the month, he presented to Congress what he called the Omnibus Bill. The word omnibus we don't use much anymore. It kind of generally means all-inclusive. And it contained a series or sets of concessions, north and south, that he thought would keep things together for a while. The odds against it passing at all were huge. Okay, if you're a Southern congressman, do you want to answer to your voters why you voted for a bill that had some pro-Northern stuff in it? If you're a Northern congressman, do you think your voters back home will understand if you voted for a bill that had some pro-Southern stuff in it? Ain't happening. Okay, so it looked like a really long shot to get it passed, and even if it passes, President Taylor has made it known that he will veto it. If you can't get it passed, you're just barely going to do that if you do it at all. Probably won't. But even if you did, you're not going to be able to override a veto. Things are looking really bleak. About the middle of the year, the wind changes. Okay, for one thing, I don't know whether Clay did this consciously or just the other guy stepped up. But there was an Illinois senator named Stephen Douglas, who would go on to be basically our most significant national politician of the 1850s. Stephen Douglas took over the floor management of the legislation. What that means is he's, doing the deals behind the scenes that could get it through. He took a very daring step. He broke the omnibus bill up into 5 different pieces of legislation. All 5 will have to pass, or it'll queer the deal. It's got to get them all through. So the odds start to look a little bit better for that. You're going to have solid support for the pro-Southern ones from the South, and there are Northern Unionists that'll vote for stuff they detest just because they love the Union that much, and vice versa. The other thing was that the president died rather suddenly. Zachary Taylor had been an Army general. His men called him Old Rough and Ready because he was casual. He'd wear an old straw hat. He was not exactly your spit and polish military guy. But anyway, he's the president. He's opposed to the bill. And in those days, he used to have a big banquet for the bigwigs in Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July. The theory is he went to this banquet, either ate too much or too much of the wrong kind of food, something like that, fell ill, and died. Probably some kind of intestinal crud rot about 5 days later. So here's our second presidential death in office. So Taylor's gone, and stepping up was a New Yorker named Millard Fillmore. And he indicated that if they could get this through Congress, he would sign it. And all 5 parts of the compromise did pass. As I mentioned a while ago, the pro-Southern portions got unanimous support from Southern congressmen and just enough Unionist support from Northerners to get it through. Same in reverse for the others. So basically, here's the deal. California is admitted to the Union as a free state with no slave state admitted to balance the Senate. So the Southerners give up the balance in the Senate, and they never got it back. In exchange for that, the rest of the Mexican cession would be divided up into the new territories of New Mexico and Utah, familiar names, unfamiliar shapes, but those would be open to slave owners to go there with their slaves under the terms of popular sovereignty. And I'm going to take this further in the next video because I'm real tight on time here.